Welcome to the Business Grind, where we give you an inside perspective on what it takes to start, build, and run a successful business. Here are your hosts, Danny Shaw and Sean Michael Wellington.
All right. Hello to everyone in podcast land today. Thanks for joining us. Sean, how you feeling?
Feeling good and ready to talk about the wrestling business this week's episode.
Yeah. So we got a good one today. It's gonna be interesting. I'm ready to dig into this. So this isn't our usual, book or movie review or stuff like that. This is just us kind of just talking through the history of wrestling, different dynamics, aspects of it, and how we've gotten to where we're at today. I'm looking forward to this because this is probably, at least in my opinion, our least scripted, because we didn't really say how we were going to talk about the history of the business. We just said, let's talk about it. You take your angle, I'll take my angle, and then we come together to the table and talk through it from here,
Yeah, we haven't really done that before. That's
Yeah,
true.
yeah. So I think this first started off when I believe you sent me an article about it was an acquisition or a merger of two of the wrestling federations or organizations, right?
TKO, the company that ended up purchasing WWE and UFC. I think that's what we're referring to, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw that article, and then as I was thinking through it, I think for me, I started reminiscing about my own journey with wrestling and knowledge of wrestling. I was like, well, maybe we can expand it a bit more and just speak to the comprehensive or as comprehensive as you can get in a podcast episode, right? And just talk
Right.
through like our own knowledge and research, and talk through the overall history of the wrestling business as a whole, right?
Right.
So yeah.
Now, before we start, though, I'm curious what level of like familiarity do you have with UFC? Did you ever watch UFC, or you ever get into that too?
Yeah, so UFC, like the mixed martial arts.
Yeah, exactly.
So all right, yeah, let's talk about our own background in relation to these sports first. So with UFC, like I'm a marginal watcher, peripheral watcher, excuse me. Like I don't know who's who of every weight class in detail and what's the next fight, but I've been aware. I know some of the bigger names. I've watched a few fights. I think for me, I used to watch UFC back when it was like banned. I don't know if people remember, like those events used to be banned, or maybe it wasn't specifically UFC, but it was some variation of those mixed martial arts events that used to be banned in certain states and stuff like that, where it wasn't as mainstream as it was now. That's when I used to kind of watch it, where you would have like karate experts in their gis fighting boxers in their boxing uniforms. Like it's a mosh posh of different fighting styles, just all in these rings without a lot of equipment and stuff like that. And I feel like now I need to go back and do some research on that as well. So that was
Yeah, that was definitely UFC. I mean, they were kind of the first ones to do it on the most mainstream platform. But like you said, it was less structured. There weren't weight classes as much. Like it's like a real sport now. You know, what I mean? It was like, okay, we have a boxer and we have a mixed martial arts jiu-jitsu guy. Let's see what happens.
Let's see what happens. If people. Yeah. I definitely remember those days, but as it's gotten a little bit more popularity, I haven't kept up as much. Like I know there was just a major championship fight recently, and I forget his name. Johns is his name.
John Jones. John Bones Jones.
Yeah. But
Madison Square Garden.
Yeah. So every now and then I'm aware. And in regards to wrestling as a whole, for me, professional wrestling, as they call it. My experience was me growing up. I was a big WWF wrestling fan. I had the wrestling blanket sets, the Hulk Hogan workout set, which really wasn't that much of a workout set. It's like a jump rope and some hand grippers and stuff like that. And I think I was an active watcher of wrestling, WWF wrestling as a kid. I would probably say up until, I want to say, I started veering off probably towards the late 90s, maybe early 2000s. I feel like that's when I started veering off. I would still keep track of, what's happening here and there, but not like active watching. Might not be totally accurate, but the Booker T, Stone Cold, Austin storyline was probably like the last time I was like engaged and kept up with what was probably going on to a certain
Okay, so that
level.
was
Yeah.
like 2002 ish
Okay,
in that
okay,
time.
got it. So yeah, so around that time then, but because that was very entertaining to me. I was definitely enjoyed that storyline. How
Oh yeah,
about you?
and they
Yeah.
had a whole fight in
And oh, the supermarket.
the
That how could
supermarket.
you not? That's classic. The whole fight in the supermarket. I still see
I
it.
had the privilege to work with the cameraman that actually shot that. That was there shooting
Oh,
them go through that one shot of the because they never stopped. There was no cuts in
it
that
was
thing. It
no
was all
cuts.
one
Yeah.
take. Yeah.
Oh wow,
So
wow,
yeah, his
got it.
name is Bubba Dean Blau. So shout out to Bubba for that.
Okay, okay, yeah, yeah. So I know you have a little bit more, deeper connections and experience with the wrestling uh, world as a whole. So why don't you share with the audience your connection and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, let's start with wrestling. So I that was my first job out of college was an internship which turned into a production assistant job at WWE, and then I was there for about 4.5 years. So it was really the foundation of a lot of my production experience and
Mm,
what I learned about live production and
mm,
video production and editing, especially. Like
mm,
I did so much editing there.
mm-hmm,
So yeah, it was really foundational. And then I got to see how some of the sausage is made,
mm-hmm,
working behind the scenes,
mm-hmm,
stuff
mm-hmm,
like that.
mm,
And in terms of UFC, similar to you, like I kind of never really, I wasn't really too big. I would peripherally watch it, but I think there were 2 points in my life where I really got deep into it. It was
mm,
one, I don't even ask me which video game it was, but one of the video games came
mm,
out, and then once you play the video game, you get to know all the fighters in the game.
mm-hmm,
So then I started actually getting into it a little bit, but that was like for that 1 year. Let's
mm-hmm,
call it like '05 or something.
mm,
And then again during COVID, like when during COVID, during 2020, they were releasing a lot of like full fights on YouTube, just
mm-hmm,
to
mm-hmm.
entertain people. So that really got me sucked in again. So I started watching again a little bit in 2020. But as the years have gone by, I fell off, and the rest of the entertainment world opened back up. I kind of fell back off. So
Right. Because
yeah.
so let me ask you. So prior to your internship, were you a wrestling fan in general? Like before?
So I was, but not like so. Your era, the era you kind of grew up in, I wasn't really into. So for
Mm-hmm.
whatever for whatever reason, I like the Hogan,
Mm-hmm.
Macho Man,
Oh man,
Ric
don't get me
Flair,
started.
all that stuff. Yeah, like that wasn't really my. I didn't, and I can tell you exactly when I started getting into it. It was 1996.
Okay.
That was
Okay.
when I started. So that was like the come up of Shawn Michaels, and so
Yeah. Okay.
that's
Okay.
where I got into it. So.
Wow. See, I didn't even know that. In my head, I just thought you were like always a wrestling fan, and then you started working for WWF.
Nah, but since 1996, I was. Yeah, once I started, Shawn Michaels got me into it, and then I kind of never stopped till I
Got
started
it.
working there. So
Got
yeah,
it. So yeah, man, yeah, so mine's that wow, see, look at that. Yeah, my track probably it definitely was a little bit earlier than yours. I remember having even the WWF wrestling WWF blankets and sheet sets as a kid in
wow.
pillowcases.
Yeah, no,
I
I didn't have any of
had
that. I
like
had the magazines. That was what I
okay,
had. I
okay,
had
got
like
it.
they
Got
had
it.
WWF magazine and Raw magazine, and I got stacks still in my bedroom back. Like if we go back to my mom's house, you'd
Got
see
it.
I have
Got it.
stacks of those.
Okay. Any so you said Shawn Michaels. Any other favorites you had and growing up as a whole or
Growing up, nah. I mean, everybody loved The Rock, everybody loved Stone Cold, but like just Shawn Michaels was like the really only person I really could think of as a favorite growing
got
up.
it, got it.
So.
So yeah, so I think for me, well, also I used to play those video games heavy, like especially on there was a version on a WWF version, which we're gonna get into the money aspect in a minute, the business aspect. There was a NES version, and then there was a Super Nintendo version. I used to play crazy, all the time. But the characters, oh man, like yeah, well you had Jake the Snake, Bam Bam Bigelow. I did. It was a lot of characters. Ultimate Warrior was my guy. That and you know what's funny when you look at some of those videos, at least for me, you see how much drugs is happening on some of these folks. Like
Yeah,
whatever they
and it was the
hyped up.
'80s.
The
Yeah,
80s, I'm like, oh, they was wildin'. But I definitely like Ultimate Warrior. I mean, I ain't go for who didn't really like Hulk Hogan. I mean, he was like a crowd favorite for sure. During his era and his time, you had the British Bulldog, Superfly Jimmy Snuka. I definitely had a range, and then you had like Coco Beware. You didn't really have there wasn't too many black prominent wrestlers at the time, but I definitely remember Coco Beware was one of my favorite.
Junkyard
Yeah,
Dog was
Yeah,
around.
Junkyard Dog. I came in a little bit after him, but I was aware of him. But Coco Beware was my guy. Virgil was never really my guy, even though I know he was around and with the. But
I
I
mean, they
did.
never really put him in a position where
Yeah,
you're gonna
they
cheer for
didn't.
him.
Right,
So,
exactly.
yeah.
But I definitely rock with the $1 Million Man and Mr. Perfect. So those are kind of the area. Rowdy Piper, which coincidentally, he made a movie with Wes Craven. Oh, was it Wes Craven and John Carpenter? I'm butchering the name, but the movie is They Live, and that movie is like one of my favorite movies of all time. Like,
Oh wow, I'm not familiar with that. Okay.
what?
Okay.
Oh, you gotta
I don't
watch.
have.
Oh, wait. All right, that's a whole nother episode. You gotta watch it. Roddy Piper did a movie called They Live. It was like a sci-fi alien movie, but it had so many meanings and layers behind under it. And then Keith David, the actor Keith David, is in that movie with him as well, and they have one of the most ridiculous fight scenes of all. It's like 20 minutes real 20 minutes of them fighting in that movie. Like it's 20, like just fighting, and when you figure out, when you watch it and you see what they're fighting for, it's kind of comical, but it's kind of like a deeper message at the same time. It's very entertaining for sure.
All right,
So
you got me intrigued
yeah.
because I'm a Keith Davis fan. So
Okay,
yeah.
okay, yeah. I think you're gonna like that. I'm gonna send that to you right after we finish this. But all right, let's get into the topic at hand, shall we? Like the business of wrestling, because I feel like we'll be here
All
just
right, so
reminiscing.
right. So where do you want to start?
Oh,
Exactly.
I think we could, if you want to. I did a little research, really speaking more into the roots before I got into the modern day wrestling, which is like the late 1800s, right? Where essentially wrestling started like with carnivals and circus and stuff, and they would be called grapplers, and they would essentially challenge the local tough guys for money, right? So similar to how we have circuses nowadays, you would have the same thing, but it would be these guys, big strong men, challenging the local people. But then over time, it seems like the promoters realized they could enhance the drama in the audience by scripting the matches and building stories, which kind of makes sense, you know?
Yeah, totally. And then a lot of that language from
Mhm.
the carnival, like, is still a part of the wrestling business. Like they still use some of the carnival slang and stuff like that.
Absolutely, they still have the ring, and they engage the audience. So when you realize that that's kind of where the roots came from, then you was like, oh, this totally makes sense, you know. But then I think this is where it kind of shifted, where it was it was less about the sport, or started becoming more about the entertainment, right? Like you create these rivalries, you create these characters that the audience could invest in, and this kind of was like the seeds of how we see wrestling today,
Yeah, the presentation. Yep.
yeah, I do recall when I was doing my research and reading, like they had to kind of change it up a bit, because back in the day, some of the matches would last for like 2.5 hours. And I'm like, I can't even imagine a regular fight. Boxing rounds is like 3 minutes. How you wrestling and fighting for 3 hours straight is kind of madness. Then eventually it started, transitioning more, and then the split between the addition of radio and television and things, all these other mediums throughout the history started adding and enhancing more to the arena of wrestling as a whole, right?
Yeah,
But
like
Mhm.
truly, like like you can't understate that. It's
Right.
like whatever the medium was, it really changes the whole like structure of the business. So
It's interesting that this is called quote unquote professional wrestling, but then the other wrestling, which is what it's kind of based off, like the Roman Olympic, you know what I mean, like wrestling is considered amateur wrestling, right?
right, yeah, it's the real sport, the competition, the non predetermined competition is considered amateur. Yeah, it's
Right,
interesting how
which is kind of wild, right? And so
the one
not
that's an Olympic sport
right, the
is
one
amateur.
that's an Olympic sport, college, NCAA sanctioned type event is considered the amateur version, but the ones where the guys with the spectacles and the outfits and so forth, they're considered the professional version of it. And I'll be, when it comes to the amateur wrestling, like I don't truly understand the whole point system and the technicals of it. I will admit to that. Like I've tried and I've my research and stuff, and I get it. But then some things I'm like, it kind of, at least to me, it kind of makes sense why that may not have taken off the way the quote unquote professional side of wrestling has.
Yeah, I feel you. I wrestled in high school, so I
Oh, my
understand
bad.
it.
He's like, I'm about to
So
come for you.
no. I say that to say I totally understand. Like from me knowing it from having doing it, the point system, like takedowns 2 points, and then
Right.
when you're on your back, that's back points and all that stuff. Like the average person's not really going to be able to comprehend that. Versus professional wrestling is 1, 2, 3, it's over, or they
Right,
tap
one,
out
two,
and it's
three,
over.
tapping out, and it's a
Yeah.
wrap. Wow, look at that! Yo, we uncovering a lot of gems today. I didn't even know that. Okay, so good deal. Thank you for dropping that nugget on us today about that. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's dope. Actually, that's dope. So then I think the business started getting divided up into territories. Yeah.
Yeah, the territory system is like, really at the advent of like where television networks were a big deal, and that's really how they promoted their shows. So
Mm,
you had different territories. You had, some in the South, you had the
mm-hmm.
East Coast territory, which ended up being WWF, you had,
Mm-hmm.
Atlanta, etc. So yeah, it was a territory system with like, 6 or 7 different places which had their own stable of wrestlers that was
Mm-hmm.
sometimes they'll send their big guy to travel to the other territories, they'll work out a deal. But it's
Mm-hmm.
very much like, separated, almost like drug dealers.
Right, yeah, like the Carter or the co-op from The Wire, something like that, right?
Right.
Right. And then they had the National Wrestling Alliance, which kind of acted as the organizing body, like of the different regions of wrestling and organizations, and they unified the territories. And sometimes they would even like crown a single world champion who would then travel to boost the ticket sales. And it was a cool system for the time being, and everyone got along for the most part, and it did what it do. But then as TV started becoming more accessible, things started changing, cracks started to form, and then Vince McMahon would soon disrupt the structure. And let's be clear, this is Vince McMahon Sr., not the Vince McMahon that we know Jr. of today.
Well, actually, I think it was a combination though, right?
Right.
Because Junior is the one who really like said, "Forget y'all territories.
Fair, fair.
I'm gonna
Okay,
disrupt the
fair.
system."
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But it was Senior's company. He's the one who built the company,
Right,
and
okay.
it got it to that point.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Okay. Thanks for that, for just that point of. So it was the father who started, but the son, Junior, who we know is the one who kind of came through and was like, the block is mine.
Broke all the rules. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, and it was really taboo at the time. Like it was an unspoken rule. These territories exist, and he said, "No, I'm going to broadcast my show in your territory, and I'm going to take your talent from you and sign
Mm-hmm.
my company, and yeah, and break those rules." And it
Yeah.
was kind of, he had the advent of cable television to kind of back
Mm-hmm.
his momentum, right? So
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He definitely rode that cable television wave, right? Um, I don't know, like I remember those pay per view events was whoo, those are the golden tickets if you could get to watch those events, because you had the regular matches that would broadcast on network television. But at least to me, the way I looked at it, they were good matches, but they were just filler. They were filler most of the time, right? Or they would be
definitely.
matches to kind of get you hyped for the main events, like the Survivor Series and the Royal Rumbles, and you know what I mean. Those events, which were pay per view, and those things were expensive. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then they had the WrestleMania. WrestleMania, even to this day, WrestleMania is WrestleMania, right? Which kind of like just kind of changed the whole landscape in the business as a whole, right?
Yeah, pay per view, and then I don't want to jump ahead too far, but it's interesting how big pay per view was as a
Mm-hmm.
revenue source for the
Mm-hmm.
business
Mm-hmm.
at that point in time. But 2024, it's a fraction of the revenue. Like pay per view doesn't really
Absolutely.
exist because they
Right.
have these streaming deals where you're watching the pay. You're not paying for the pay per view, at least for
Mm-hmm.
WWF system.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's just
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it's the model keeps changing. You have to keep, what do you say, disrupt the system. All those terms that we talk about all the time in business. You have to keep changing and not getting stagnant and so forth. But once that started happening and Junior started really running and breaking and saying this is how I'm moving and get with me or get away from me. Then Ted Turner started his wrestling firm, right? His
And that was
wrestling.
interesting because he had deep pockets to like play
Right,
ball, right?
right.
That was always Vince Jr.'s kind of advantage, as he was in the East Coast territory, and they kind of generated the most money being on the coast, being in New York. And
Uh-huh.
now you got, even though he's a Southern Atlanta business, right? TBS and Turner is based out of Atlanta,
Yeah.
but still, he's got deep pockets. He's got that bread. So
Right. Were you a WCW fan or watcher at the time?
honestly, no, I didn't really get into WCW. With I'll give you two exceptions. Their
Okay.
video game was fire. It made me get N64. I think it was Revenge. Was it WCW Revenge?
Uh-huh.
That I didn't. It made me buy N64. I was like, Mom, I want that for Christmas just so I can
Wow.
have that game.
Okay.
And then I know Goldberg had a big match with Hulk Hogan. I watched that. I remember watching that live from the Georgia Dome, and that might have been 1996 also. But yeah.
Okay. Okay. So for me, I gradually started watching WCW. For me, I guess I was younger. I was all I knew was WWF. I didn't know the business of wrestling. I didn't know that these other things exist. These other wrestling organizations existed. So I was watching WWF, which is now WWE, for not to confuse the audience. They had to change their name eventually, but for when I was watching, it was WWF. But when WCW came about, to be quite honest, I just viewed them as a knockoff. I was like, in my mind, I couldn't really comprehend that there could be more than one wrestling organization.
I mean, and that's a fair assessment of kind of their early product anyway. They weren't very different or very like groundbreaking. It wasn't
Not really.
until, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, they weren't. But for me and my now we have these. We do these episodes and we know things about business and stuff, and we know there's more than one competitor in the field and in the arena. But back then, I'm like, who are these folks, right? I couldn't. It took me a while to kind of accept it, but eventually, I started watching it and becoming familiar with some of the characters over on that side. Such, that's where I was introduced to Ric Flair, because at the time Ric Flair wasn't at WWE; he was WCW. Lex Luger was over there as well. I think
Sting was their big guy.
Sting was their big guy. That I did like Sting. Sting was definitely the big guy over there. I did like Sting. I ain't gonna front. I think for me, once that NWO storyline started forming and taking place, that's when I think they was really they I don't want to say they arrived, but that's when I felt like it started to feel like they was doing their own thing at that point. I might be wrong. My timeline and my memory of it may be warped, but for me, once
Nah,
that
that's accurate.
okay,
It's a famous, not famous, but maybe infamous. They won the ratings, because at this point in time, we're talking about 96, 97. WWE, WWF, and WCW went head to head on Monday nights. They both had the show on at the same time,
right?
And WCW won 72 weeks in a row, right? They beat them in the ratings 72 weeks in a row. So you're not wrong. Like at that point when the NWO stuff happened and they really took over the popularity.
Okay, fair enough. Say, I was like, I hope my memory is. I hope I'm not rewriting, my thoughts on what happened during that time. But that NWO era was kind of serious. I felt like everyone was involved in that storyline at one point.
Yep.
It felt like that. So I think at one point, because of the competition, and like you just said, it kind of forced them into WWE buying WCW, right? And
well, what happened was the merger between AOL and Time Warner. That's what really caused. I mean, there was other factors, of course, but that was why Vince McMahon Jr. was able to buy WCW for such a cheap price.
There we go. Okay, see, I was not okay. Good point on that. So then now the merger or the buy-in of that, and it kind of. I think for me, again, so that was like the early 2000s. And then from there, I think I kind of just started petering off and watching, life happens. I definitely was aware of some of the bigger names that came afterwards, like The Rock and John Cena. And, I was aware, but I wasn't really keeping up with the storylines actively and seeing what was going on and what have you.
Right.
Right.
And that's across the board. That's really after that is where their business overall and popularity overall kind of went down because the competition was gone. Right? There was only one game in town. So.
Okay, yeah. So that's for the uninitiated or the unfamiliar. I guess that's our quick timeline of the wrestling business and how we're at where we're at. But I think from the business side, as I've watched them over the years and just even my own experience being a fan of the sport. I think there was a few things that kind of stood out to me from a business side that I started noticing early on. I think even early on, the whole stigma or storyline around wrestling being fake, right? I always felt like wrestling as a community was a small community and a niche community. And then once I started seeing them on talk shows and started having movies and stuff like that, and I was still a young kid, so I was like, "Oh, it's bigger than what I thought." And I'm not even talking about the movies we're seeing today. I'm talking about when Hulk Hogan had that movie with Debo, right?
Right.
Little Host Bar. I was like, "Oh, is this a mainstream moment? Are we breaking it to the mainstream?" I remember there would be talk shows where they would have the wrestlers appear on these talk shows, and to me, I was like, "Oh, it's not as a small of a niche community or thing as I thought it was." And then I started seeing things gradually happen, like the WWF restaurant opening in Times Square, right? I think for me, that's when I really was like, wow, this from a business perspective, this thing is getting bigger and bigger than who would have imagined if you were an early fan of the sport.
Yeah, right. I remember Hogan was on Arsenio at one point, right?
Yeah, oh yeah, I forgot about that. So, well, and you would always have these one-off appearances. I think, like Hogan. Hogan was a star regardless. Was a star in general, right? So outside of the sport of wrestling, he was a star. He was in the Rocky movies. He was, like you said, he would do these things. But then I think as far as it being accepted overall, just wrestling overall into the main conscious outside of just the one-off superstars, is really, when I started saying, well, you can always have one-offs, one superstar out of a niche community or group or whatever, right? Coach, subculture. But then once that actual entity is being accepted by the masses, that's when it's the next level, which is, for me, I feel where wrestling then moved to. It's like it's accepted by the masses and fans are just outright open with their appreciation of the sport, right?
Right. And it's interesting because the timeline you're discussing really does coincide with their business moves, right?
Mm-hmm.
So around the time you're talking about after they acquired WCW, and then when they had the restaurant in Times Square, that was very close to when they went public, right? They were a
Mm-hmm.
private company, and then they opened on the NASDAQ and became a public company,
Mm-hmm.
publicly traded company. So with that public traded company resources, they were able to do other ventures like try the XFL, do that
Right.
restaurant,
Right.
etc. So
I forgot about that. The XFL, they started transitioning to that as well. So they were kind of all over. And then it wasn't lost that, more wrestlers, even if they weren't super, super big names in the wrestling arena, like they were big enough, but they were already transitioning into other venues such as acting and well, mainly acting and some music and so forth. As we saw the Dwayne Rock Johnson transition, but then you have like the David Batistas and other folks who've transitioned, and not just transitioning to play a wrestler, which was like the early versions of the transition. Like Hulk Hogan was pretty much Hulk Hogan throughout all his acting endeavors, right? Even if he wasn't
yeah.
technically Hulk Hogan, it was a variation similar. Like Macho Man. Macho Man was Macho Man whether you saw him on TV or not. He never broke character, right?
Yeah, and Spider-Man 1, Macho, he was
Yeah,
just Macho Man.
he was
Yep.
Macho Man, right? Where now you see these wrestlers who have transitioned, and when they're acting or doing other things, they're not just that wrestler. They are trying to be taken or be seen in other lights, right? I follow people on social media for their respective takes on different topics. It could be politics, tech stuff, business stuff. Like, oh, this is the person I go to see what their insights is about business or whatever, or design. But then when a main wrestling event, it's like no matter what bubble these people are in, they're tweeting or posting about wrestling, which is always amusing to me because it's like wrestling has fans everywhere, right? So the person
Yeah.
who's always talking about tech all of a sudden is talking about the main event happening tonight or something like that, right?
Yeah, that's always interesting where you kind of see see that community get together, right?
Yeah, I remember when Bad Bunny was recently at one of the matches. I think it was about a year ago in Puerto Rico. Oh man, that was bananas. The timeline was on fire. Puerto Rico was on fire. It was crazy. And it's like this super international star is like a wrestling fan is in the ring doing this thing with these other fighters.
Yeah, bad, but yeah, that
Yeah,
was crazy.
yeah. And
Yeah.
over the years we've seen the crossover of other athletes in other arenas who have done crossovers with WWF or wrestling as a whole. We've seen it with Mike Tyson, seen it with Mayweather. You always see it. Like, so there's a lot of appreciation, even though people may speak about it being fake or not real and things like that. There definitely seems to be a appreciation from athletes in other arenas for the work that they do, and always seem to have a good time when they're wrestling with these other superstars and stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
All right. So let's dig a little bit into the backbone and the business side and the money making side of all these endeavors and so forth. So we talked a little bit about the pay-per-view event, Sean, right?
Yeah. And
And
then one thing we didn't really we touched on, but we didn't get into was like the live events, right?
yeah.
The non-televised shows that you go to in your local area, the
Mm-hmm.
traveling stuff,
Mm-hmm.
which we talked about a lot in the two of our previous episodes, the and one episode,
Mm-hmm.
and forgive me, what was the other one where they did the traveling American Gladiators, that's what it
Mm-hmm.
was.
American
So
Gladiators.
both of those, the grind of going on the road and having to do your show multiple days a week for multiple weeks for multiple
Mm-hmm.
months, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was a real part of the wrestling business for a
Mm-hmm.
long time. So
Mm-hmm. And it's very grueling. It takes a toll on your body, right? I think
sure.
with all of the business cases that we've kind of dug into, I think what we can see is that when the business is based off a lot of traveling and a lot of shows and a lot of performance day in and day out, we see the toll that it takes on the body. So we saw it with the American Gladiators, we saw it with the And1 mixtapes, and we're seeing it with these wrestlers. Like, I think the stats was like out of 365 days, like you're probably on the road as a wrestler like 300 days out the year. Like,
Right. And that's just the nature of the business because that's how they make money, right? Those
right.
ticket sales is what is your check. That's where your
Right.
check comes from.
Right. And then, I think eventually, it started expanding other arenas such as the merchandise sales, the TV ratings, and so forth. But, similar to, I think, what was happening a lot with the AM1 business model is like, well, what happens if you're not the biggest draw? What happens if you're not the biggest star that's at these events? And what's your take? How do you get paid? And what's happening on that side, right?
Right. That's a big factor.
Very big factor. And then, outside of that, then there's additional streams, right? So then we talked about the video games, right? We talked about there's the television rights, right?
And that's relatively new, right? The
Right.
TV rights, because
Mm-hmm.
it's funny because the business used to be backwards to what it is now, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you go in, let's call it 1994, right?
Mm-hmm.
The business model and the structure was you have a television show to promote to get people to buy your pay-per-view,
Mm-hmm.
or B, buy their local ticket in their area to come see you guys live at the show
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to your town, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now the structure doesn't even work that way. They very rarely do a lot less live events and live shows. They have acquisition rights where they've gotten paid to show their show on these cable networks and on these streaming services. They're getting paid to broadcast their shows, and there are no pay-per-views, so nobody has to buy a pay-per-view. You're not pushing anyone to buy a pay-per-view. They still promote these big events with big matches, like you alluded to before, where you get the high quality, high WrestleMania level matches, but it's no longer a pay-per-view. It's not the main revenue stream anymore if you have a streaming service subscription. So it's interesting how live events, the thing that really broke down the bodies and really wore down these wrestlers and these performers, is now kind of been phased out.
Yeah. And then, they've also gone, I mean, sponsorship is always going to be a part of the business, especially if you're a live events business, things like that. But, they do partner with a whole bunch of brands for event sponsorship, right? So,
Yeah.
and then I think also with the licensing deals, right? So clearly we can see the impact of the licensing deals on a daily basis. T-shirt, merchandise, video games, clothing. I had the bed sheet set way back in the day, right? Toys. toys. I'm sorry. Go ahead. You was
Magazines, as I was no, I was just
yeah.
saying names of magazines, like I was saying. Yep.
Right. But I think another thing to be mindful of is that we're speaking about it from the big wrestling corporation business model perspective. I think we also have to acknowledge that there are multiple independent wrestling organizations and circuits that's happening consistently, and they don't necessarily move that same way. They don't really have the infrastructure to move that way. Social media has allowed them to be a bit more prominent, and you kind of see that happening. You see those events on social media and stuff like that, but they're a little bit more independent, and they don't have those same type of deals and royalties and so forth. So they still usually rely on like the ticket sales and community engagement. So they still rely on kind of the older model, right?
100%. Yeah, at that
Yeah.
level, if you're not on a big streaming network or a television network like TBS,
Right.
or if you don't have any sort of like other revenue source with a big advertiser, then yeah, the ticket sales is how you pay your bills. Yeah.
Right. Considering what I do know, and we're gonna get into that in just a second. The industry, the working conditions, and so forth. It's a very grueling process, right? And there's no guarantee if you can make it. There's no guarantee, and so you gotta really kind of have a passion and a love for this to make it, so to speak, because early on you're not going to
Yeah.
be making much money. There's you got to keep honing yourself. There's no refinement. There's not a lot of advisors to kind of to help you refine your act at that level, right? So you kind of have to do it all on your own until you do blow up. So it is kind of good that they have that development program going on to kind of help.
Right.
And these athletes, they do, and they are athletes in my opinion. Like, I just want to be very clear. Maybe some people may feel some way because these matches are scripted, so to speak, but the work you have to do to even perform these scripts and execute on it is not. You don't just walk off the street doing this, right? You gotta
Facts.
really put in some work and practice, and know your work and know your routines and know the moves to kind of work a match in the audience as well, which leads to the injuries are that just kind of comes with the territory, right? You're going to have to be okay with taking on injuries if this is the career that you want to do, right? Which also leads to the controversies around the compensation to these athletes, because my understanding is that a lot of these wrestlers are responsible for their own travel, their gear, their healthcare costs. All these things can add up. So, like, if you're not a top tier earner in the organizations, it's gonna create a significant financial strain. Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely accurate. They're not technically, even though they're exclusive to certain companies,
Right.
they're technically not employees, right? They're
Right.
technically independent contractors, so they don't
Mm-hmm.
get the benefit of health insurance and things
Mm-hmm.
like that.
Yeah. So that has always been like a thing, right? Which also, hmm, it involves long-term injuries, right? And then it also, we have to kind of speak to the elephant in the room, which is like the type of, because we're talking about health, we have to talk about the physique, we have to talk about the supplement and steroid usage in the industry, and what kind of impact that does to these wrestlers on their body and as well as their mental, as there have been some very tragic and extreme cases of these athletes that have succumbed to these drugs, and uh, uh, the way they've treated their bodies over the years, for a shot at success.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, especially in the '80s, like we alluded to earlier, there was less regulation, less testing, and
Mm-hmm.
it left an environment where, yeah, a lot of people were living an unhealthy lifestyle to maintain their physiques and their athletic appearances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if everyone is more or less considered a 1099, and that basically you are your own business as a wrestler, even when you quote unquote make it, you are your own business. And when you realize that, and you start understanding the business model of wrestling as a whole, it's not hard for me to see why a lot of athletes are are okay with transitioning to something else that may be a bit more safe and take less of a toll on their body. And I know they love the fans and they love, the fans love them, but I also understand why they're usually hesitant to get back in the ring. Or when they do get in the ring, it's not as it's less the matches are not as extreme, right?
Definitely, yeah. They
Yeah.
they tend to like be safer and try to protect themselves a lot.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think with that being said, what do you think, in regards to the business? We've talked about, the history, the structure, the business, the business model. How do you look at the future of wrestling, and where do you like see it going next?
I mean, I think the future is bright for it. That acquisition that we talked about very early in the beginning, where they're kind of part of a bigger conglomerate with UFC, it really helps them try to merge the audiences. One thing, right? Because it's a separate audience. People who watch UFC are watching a non-predetermined outcome sport, and people who are watching WWE are watching, entertaining athletic performance. But I do already see them trying to find the people who would appreciate both things, right, and crossing them over. So it also gives them access to a lot more revenue to do a lot more things. They've been doing a lot of shows, both companies in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, and which are big paydays, right? So yeah, I think and again the TV rights fees, right? The NBA, the NFL, and now pro wrestling is in that conversation as well. Is like these things are being negotiated every 3 or 4 years for hundreds of millions of dollars. So
Yeah, no, absolutely. All great points. I think for me, outside of these avenues, I think the future is also with the women audience as well.
wow, that's a great point. You know what? That's a great point you make, and I didn't even think of that because that's exploded in its own right.
Absolutely, absolutely. I see it all the time. Like even now, when I was in my heyday of watching wrestling, they had their own separate women's wrestling, and it never kind of really took off. I believe Netflix even had a series about it. I think the Glow Wrestling, right? Or I think it was based
Yep.
off the women's wrestling. So I definitely remember the women's wrestling coming up, but it not really taking off. I do remember the introduction of certain early on wrestling. The women characters were like sidekicks, like Miss Elizabeth, you know what I mean, and stuff like that. They wasn't really as prominent. I think towards me transitioning out of like being a core fan, you had China who passed away, tragically, and I it was it Sable, I think that was her
Yeah,
name, but
it's huge. She had
yeah.
she was a big, yeah, she's one of the biggest stars too.
Right.
Yeah.
So China and Sable at the time were like the two main women wrestlers that I. Oh, it was another one. It was a short, stocky sister. She's black. Was her name Jackie?
Jacqueline?
Yes, there we
Jacqueline.
go. Yeah. So those are like my main like. So we got about three, right? And now, even as a backseat watcher who checks it out from time to time, the explosion of women wrestlers is like crazy to me, and it's good to see. And I think for me, what I like is that they're not just regulated to like they're just as active as the men, like those moves
Yeah,
and
they have cage matches and all
yeah,
types of, yeah,
which
yeah.
which I think leaves a lot of opportunity for them to grow there, because women have always been fans of wrestling, right? And it's to me to kind of see how they're being incorporated into the scene, into the mix. There's definitely going to be a lot of growth and potential in that side of the spot as well. So yeah, they're knucking and bucking just like the other dudes is nowadays, which is kind of wild to see, but a good thing to see at the same time. So yeah. So any closing thoughts? Any final thoughts as we wrap up this episode about the industry and business of professional wrestling?
Just one kind of totally left field since we've been talking about the parent company TKO and the
Uh-huh.
UFC. Are you familiar with? Oh, okay, so the and I forget exactly what they call it, but that dome they have in Vegas, right?
Oh, that dome, the
Yeah,
the lit up one. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I forget what the technical name is
Yeah,
for it,
yeah.
sorry.
It's
But
it's a dome in Vegas.
right. But recently UFC did a big event there. They had a match there, and they really made full use. It was like, tens of millions of dollar production, but they really made use of that space and of that LED, whatever it is, interactive space. And then when we get off, I'll show you. I'll send you a video of it. But it's really cool, and I just bring that up because I think that may be something that is emulated in the sister company in WWE, right? I can see it was very WWE, and I can see them utilizing that space and that kind of technology for their shows too, for WrestleMania or something.
Okay, yeah, no, I can see that. I think, with all this being said, one thing I at least for me, I will, with all the technology, all the platforms, there's always going to be new ways to kind of monetize and new revenue streams for this. But I think for me, what I've always enjoyed is the storyline. So if they have to, as long as they can kind of maintain the core storytelling, because the storylines is always entertaining to me. That's what always kept me hooked in, right? Like
100%. That's what gets everybody.
Exactly.
Yep.
So as long as they can balance that storyline along with all these new innovations and things that they are trying to do, then I think it'll be fine. Granted, as with all things in business, nothing is a guarantee, and you're not going to always get it right all the time. But I think you kind of have to keep the storytelling good and let it progress and evolve as it needs to be, along with the audience taste and so forth. So
yeah, that's definitely a good point.
Cool,
for sure.
Cool. All right, well, I think that wraps up our deep dive into serious business and wrestling today. I really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed just doing my research. It brought up a lot of good memories of just my own youth growing up and watching it, but also kind of seeing how it has evolved and taken shape over these years.
Yeah, it was just interesting to go down memory lane, me as a fan and of someone that used to work there for a couple of years too.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so that's a wrap for this week's episode. We hope you enjoyed our business dive into the entertaining world of wrestling. Hopefully it provided you with some value and inspiration as you navigate through your own business journey in life. As always, if you have a question you would like us to answer on the show, please shoot us a message on any of our social media channels. Also, don't forget to subscribe and share on Spotify and iTunes. See you again soon. In the meantime, keep grinding.
The Business Grind is for entertainment purposes. The opinions expressed are those solely of the host and guests. Please consult with a professional and exercise discretion before engaging in any business endeavors.
Man, I'm out here on the grind. I'm out here on the grind. I'm out here on the grind.